And after that, he wants to take her on an adventure to the Everglades. And this is where people go in droves to work. And his plan is that he's going to pick beans and he's going to party at night and gamble. And they're just going to kind of live from the seat of their pants, and they're going to have a really good time. So of course this sounds very exciting to her, and they end up going there. And while they're there, he teaches her to shoot, and that is foreshadowing later on. I won't say what, but it is a foreshadow of what happens, because Janie becomes a very good shot. Like, she shoots this hawk in one shot, and it's not even ruined, I guess. But it comes very natural to her. And the work in the Everglades seems to be the type of work that's really suited for her. She's not happy at the store. And nothing, as hard as she tries, it doesn't come naturally to her. But you take her outside and say, okay, here's a gun, I'm going to teach you how to shoot, and she immediately picks it up. And I think that just is kind of her nature, because she is always more at home with nature. And that's kind of the way she wants to work. That's what she enjoys. So she, like, she enjoys fishing. And so she later really enjoys hunting. So by working, Tea Cake manages to get a house for them. And he works and works, and then they have the kind of lifestyle that they want to have. But then he notices that he's getting lonely out there. At least that's what he says. Janie wonders if he's just coming home to check on her to see if there's anybody there. But he says, no, I'm lonesome. I want you out there with me picking beans. And she's perfectly fine with that. Even though even the people out there see Janie as being somebody of a different class. Like, why would she be out there doing this? But Janie's, perfectly happy to do it. It says, and he says, I hope you don't resent me for making you work. And she says, this is so much better than the store. She likes to be with people. She likes to be outside. So they have a pretty happy time together while they're there and while it lasts. And now you see she's starting to participate with the community, and she's not isolated anymore like Joe, because Tea Cake doesn't. Now you do find out that Tea Cake does get jealous, but he's not going to isolate her. It says the men held big arguments here, and just as they used to at the store porch. Only here she could listen and laugh and even talk some herself if she wanted to. She got so she could tell big stories herself, and listening to the rest, because she loved to hear it and the men loved to hear themselves, they would woof and boogaboo around the games to a limit. No matter how rough it was, people seldom got mad, because everything was done for a laugh. And I think she's just really trying to get a picture of the town people and the community, and the lightheartedness of it. They worked hard, but in the evenings they could cut up and they could enjoy themselves, and this is the same as entertainment. So I'm moving a little bit fast, but there's not like 15 is a page and a half, but by chapter 15, the first thing she says in this ominous voice is Janie learned what it felt like to be jealous. And like I said, what goes up must go down. And so this girl, who she calls Chunky, was out for Tea Cake. And she's doing the things that you always see people doing, stealing their backpacks or whatever. They're flirting, taking things, making it into a chase. And this is what they're doing, and Janie was irritated about this. But at one point, he disappears with her and they're on the ground struggling. But this is interesting. In the beginning, Tea Cake didn't seem to be able to fend her off properly, as promptly as Janie thought he ought to. She began to be snappish a little. A little seed of fear was growing into a tree. So this fear, this is where jealousy comes from, is the fear of not having whatever it is, or someone is taking this from you. And she already has kind of, a hang up about Tea Cake running off, because Tea Cake is who he is, and he's younger and good looking. And so she kind of knows what she's getting into with him. The question is it really worth it? So she confronts them as she sees them, like maybe laying on the ground together, and she tries to fight Nookie, but she runs off, and she's of course giving him the silent treatment, and then after a while again she lets it go. Alright, so as the season changed, people came and went as they came in droves. Tea Cake and Janie decided to stay since they wanted to make another season on the muck. There was nothing to do after they had gathered several bushels of dried beans to save over and sell to the planters in the fall. So Janie began to look around to see people and things she hadn't noticed during the season. And this is more of her kind of going out and being a part of the community. But chapter 16 is interesting because it introduces Mrs. Turner. And Mrs. Turner, I think, represents kind of the class system within the African Americans, because she feels entitled or superior to them because she is half white, I assume, and she has white features. Because she has those features, she feels like she's kind of better than the race, and she puts black people down. And so Janie, of course, is kind of stuck between this. Tea Cake, I guess, is very dark, so she doesn't like Tea Cake. And, Janie, it's not real clear about how Janie feels about Miss Turner. She doesn't really know what to think. She hasn't been put in this situation before, when someone is constantly talking bad about her own race. Janie's coffee and cream complexion and her luxurious hair made Mrs. Turner forgive her for wearing overalls like the other women who worked in the fields. She didn't forgive her for marrying a man as dark as Tea Cake, but she felt that she could remedy that. And so she has a brother, and she thinks that her brother and Janie would be perfect for each other. Of course, Janie is not interested, but Tea Cake hears this conversation. And in one of the critiques that Mrs. Turner makes about black people, she says, and they makes me tired, always laughing. They laugh so much, and the laugh's too loud, always singing old nigger songs, always cutting the monkey for white folks. And if it wasn't for so many black folks, it wouldn't be no race problems. The white folks would take us in with them. The black ones is what's holding us back. And she even suggests that she and Janie should be in a different race of their own. But they can't be with white people. And she just says that that's not fair. But, I mean, what's ironic about that is like, okay, but they feel about you as you feel about others, and you say that that's not fair. So, of course, she's coming around, and Tea Cake's worried that she'll have an influence on Janie, and then even more worried that Janie might actually leave him for her brother. So this creates a jealousy with him. he tries to talk to her husband about it, and the husband says, you know what, she does whatever she wants to do, and I don't stop her. And he laughed a high, lungless laugh. The children don't keep her in mode. She visits with who she chooses. And Tea Cake says, the children? You mean you got one smaller than him? He indicated his son, who seemed around 20 or so. I ain't seen your others. And he says, I reckon because they've all passed on before this one was born. We ain't had no luck at all with children. And lucky to raise him. He's the last stroke of exhausted nature. So that's kind of an interesting way to talk about his son, that he's of exhausted nature, that there wasn't any other children who survived for whatever reason. So after that it says, Janie tried that, but short of telling Mrs. Turner bluntly, there was nothing she could do to discourage her completely. She felt honored by Janie's acquaintance. She quickly forgave and forgot snubs in order to keep it. Anyone who looked more white folkish than herself was better than she was in her criteria. Therefore, it was right that they should be cruel to her at times, just as she was cruel to those more negroid than herself, in direct ratio to their negroness, like the pecking order in a chicken yard. Insensate cruelty to those you can whip, and groveling submission to those you can't. Once having set up her idols and built altars to them, it was inevitable that she would worship there. It was inevitable that she should accept any inconsistency and cruelty from her deity. She's looking at Janie it kind of in the same way as someone would look to God, and feeling that, and she makes this point that real gods make us suffer. Real gods want sacrifice. And so she bows down to Janie just because Janie seems more white than anybody else. And so it goes on. And what's also interesting is, like I said before, most of the time you get Hurston's commentary in the beginning of the chapter, and this one happens towards the end with Mrs. Turner. So, once having set up her idols and built altars to them, it was inevitable that she would worship there. It was inevitable that she should accept any inconsistency and cruelty from her deity, as all good worshippers do from theirs. All gods who receive homage are cruel. All gods dispense suffering without reason. Otherwise, they would not be worshipped. Through indiscriminate suffering, men know fear, and fear is the most divine emotion. It is the stones for altars at the beginning of wisdom. Half gods are worshipped in wine and flowers. Real gods require blood. Mrs. Turner, like other believers, had built an altar to the unattainable Caucasian characteristics for all. Her God would smite her, would hurl her from pinnacles and lose her in deserts, but she would not forsake his altars. In a way, this reminds me of Revelations, where people will start worshiping idols, and then you have the Antichrist, because their idea of God is it's almost like it's beyond themselves to become like God, that it seems fitting for someone like her to be less than, and this is very complicated because it's her critique of religion. But she starts off with the pecking order in a chicken yard. And like I said before about, man climbing a ladder from starting from his dung pile, or nature, how it is indifferent to urine and perfume. That, I think, for Hurston is where the God exists in that nature. But man-made God is what she's really criticizing, because it's a projection again of what other people have, and it's kind of materialized. And so if it's comes out of a sense of greed and materialism, and this is her view of God, certainly not mine, but that's what she's bowing down to. And so it's a very false sense of religion in the first place. So Mrs. Turner, like all believers, had an altar. Okay, so behind her crude words was a belief that somehow she and others, through worship, could attain her paradise, a heaven of straight-haired, thin-lipped, high-nosed, boned, white seraph. So when I think back to Richard Wright's criticism that she is not interested in racial relationships, I think that's wrong. I think she's really criticizing it here. She's mocking, satirizing just the class system in general, especially as it's based on color, and even a different shade of color, and so this is what this woman represents. It is also what makes her a hateful person, because she's put people at a place where they can't aspire for goodness, for who they are, but for what they look like. So it's a very shallow understanding, at any rate, So anyway, so the physical impossibilities in no way injured faith. That was the mystery, and the mysteries are the chores of God. Beyond her faith was a fanaticism to defend the altars of her God. It was distressing to emerge from her inner temple and find the black desecrators howling with laughter before the door. So it's very serious words, I think, than what she has in the way that she describes what happens with Mrs. Turner and Mrs. Turner's in entitlement. And Tea Cake fixes all this with one remark. He says, "All don't make God look so foolish," finding fault with everything he made. And that's, I think, kind of Tea Cake's redeeming quality about speaking the truth. At this point, you despite what you think with this God, he made all of us uniquely for whatever reason, and it's all beautiful, it's all good. Whatever is created is good. And so it ends with this is kind of why Mrs. Turner has this frown that's like permanently on her face. She had much to disapprove of, especially since she couldn't be part of the other world that she admired, for whatever reason. And that's kind of the end of this part. So I know that's kind of short, but I should stop here because we're going to go into a different plot. Really, the plot has been thickening. You've gotten a lot of background information, but then we've got to get to even more of the action that brings Janie to self-actualization. Okay, so enough for today. Thanks. Bye.